Hey guys, thanks for checking this out. This is our still motion guide to EOS lenses for weddings and events.
So what lens is better for a Steadicam?
There's two main lenses we use with the Steadicam, 24 and the 14. When we're shooting with the 5D, we find that the 24 is the perfect fit. Recently, when we started shooting more with the 70 and the Mark IV, we found that the 24, when added to the crop factors, was just a little too tight. So then we moved over to the 14-2.8 rectilinear. We really love the 14 rectilinear, as opposed to, say, the 16-35 2.8, which is so common, because the distortion on this lens is less apparent.
If you had to choose one, which would you prefer?
If I had to choose just one lens for my moving shots, it would probably be the 14, and that's because it has a shorter hyperfocal distance. The 24 has a 10-foot hyperfocal distance, whereas the 14 is 3 feet. So if I'm using a Steadicam with a 24, that means that everything needs to stay at least 10 feet away from me, or I've got to actually be changing focus while I'm moving. With the 14, however, the hyperfocal distance is 3 feet. So that means everything only needs to be further than 3 feet away, and that's much more manageable.
But the 24 is also a really great wide-angle lens. It allows you to get that really narrow depth of field, which is amazing on the slider because then you can have movement with a really shallow depth of field.
Hey, so what lenses do you guys shoot with the most?
If we're not on Steadicam and not doing moving shots, we're usually on a monopod, and for that we have two main lenses, the 50 and the 35. We decide between which one we're going to use, generally based on what camera we're shooting with, as well as what we're actually shooting. The 35 we find is a perfect pairing with the 7D. When you add that to the 1.6 crop factor, it's roughly equivalent to a 50mm field of view. Whereas the 50mm lens is perfect with the Mark IV, which has a smaller crop factor, or the 5D, which is full frame. In terms of what you're filming, we generally prefer the 35 when you're shooting groom preps, because usually that's a little bit less predictable and the guys are usually moving around a little bit more. You get a little bit more distortion out of a wider lens like the 35, which we also find adds to things like the groom preps. Whereas the 50 is perfect if you're shooting things like makeup or bridal preps, where things are generally a little bit more predictable and people are moving around less. The 50 with a Mark IV is also a really awesome lens on a monopod for things like vows if you're doing an outdoor ceremony. It does require you to get a little bit closer than some people would like, but having a focal length that's fairly close to what the human eye sees, it really immerses you in the scene like you're an audience member at the actual wedding.
Every day I wonder how somebody who grew up speaking a different language than me, in a different country, on a different continent, could understand me so completely.
Another awesome thing about the 35 and the 50 is that they're both really small and they're not very intimidating. Having a small prime like this allows you to be within 2 to 3 feet, and often people aren't really reacting as if, say, you had a 70-200.
When events are a little more predictable, such as the first dance, and you know exactly where the couple is going to be dancing, using the 85 1.2 at 1.2 really allows you to knock out that background. It looks absolutely incredible.
So what about the ceremony when you want to be further away from the bride and groom?
Our first choice for the ceremony would be the 135 f2. Most churches are generally pretty dark, as are receptions, so the f2 aperture is quite bright and allows you to shoot in most locations with little to no extra lighting. The 135 is also very small, and it's black. The 70-200 and many of Canon's longer lenses are white, and if you're shooting in a church and you're moving around on a monopod, you want a lens that is nice and small, and black makes it much more inconspicuous.
And a man's word is a bond and binding and can never be broken. So in front of all of my fathers here, I give you my word.
But why would I get a 135 when a 70-200 does 135 and more?
We choose the 135 over the 70-200 in most cases because, again, it's very small, which means that we can move around a lot more on a monopod, but as well, we actually prefer the look of the bokeh much more on the 135 as opposed to the 70-200.
But don't you use any zooms?
The one zoom we do use is 70-200 2.8 IS. During ceremonies, a lot of things are usually happening, and this lens allows us to zoom in and zoom out depending on the situation. Because of our shooting style and predominantly using monopods for the majority of our filming, IS in the lens definitely helps our footage be a little less shaky. However, the one drawback to having the IS so close to the camera body is sometimes you may pick up a little bit of that noise, unless of course you're using an external shotgun microphone, which really helps tone that down.
Today we mostly talked about which lenses we use, but what we didn't cover is why, and for us that's a much more important question. For example, Which lens would you choose if you want to add more comedy to your film? Or which lens would you choose if you want more drama?
We're looking forward to sharing even more with you guys this July on the Cinema Caravan.